My mum died when I was 18, and aside from just pain and sadness, I was also left with an overwhelming feeling of isolation. Grief is such an intense experience, but it's also very unique to the individual, and then on top of that, it's quite stigmatized. Like, people don't like to talk about it, so isolation is just a really common thing that people go through after a loved one dies. So it ends up being just quite unlikely that you interact with someone or you meet someone who really gets what you're going through, no matter how well-intentioned your kind of friends and loved ones are. So since returning to reading a few years ago, I've really enjoyed looking for books to help with that processing and to find that kind of sense of solidarity and community. And it's been really cool, like whether it be me just seeking out a book that I know is about grief, or whether I'm just reading a book and grief or death or like something I relate to springs out at me and I'm just suddenly being emotionally gut punched. It's been a really cathartic and positive experience, and I want to share it with you. I thought it was high time that I gave you a rundown of my favourite grief books. I don't really like traditional self-help, so you're not going to really find much of that in this list. Memoirs, novels, we've got some screenplays in there, a bit of poetry, and I'm just going to break down why I love each one. And to be honest, this video is for people who are grieving and for people who want to learn how to support people who are grieving a bit better, but it's also for everyone. Like, I think everyone needs to read a bit more about grief and death, because it's like the one certainty in life, so it's kind of ridiculous that it's still a little bit not spoken about, and you never know. That's not meant to be a threat, but you do never know, unfortunately. So let us begin. Oh, here's my stack, by the way. It was too heavy to... I wanted to hold it through the intro, but I think that's just a ridiculous idea. Oh, things are falling out. I mostly have these books in person actually, which is exciting for me. First up, we have Crying in H Mart. This is a memoir by Michelle Zauner, who is Japanese Breakfast. I think that's the name of her band, but she's the front woman for Japanese Breakfast. And in this book, she talks about growing up Korean American in the US and the death of her mother from cancer. This book is honestly one of my favorite books of all time. It's stunning. Like, it really surprised me. I had pretty high expectations, and obviously it is kind of popular, but I really think it's still underrated. It should be more popular. The way she writes is like so precise and moving, but it's also completely unpretentious, and like her ability to just identify her emotions and I guess just her emotional intelligence is astounding, especially because this memoir is about events that happened relatively recently. So it's a pretty incredible amount of insight for someone who recently went through such a traumatic thing. As you can see, it's not crazy long, so no excuse. Another really strong thread in the book is just her kind of identity crisis that is triggered by her mum's diagnosis and her mum's death because of her being Korean American but growing up in the US. It also depicts a really complex relationship between her and her mum, which I found really beautiful. I think that's a really important thing to talk about. Relationships are complicated, and when someone dies, you are forced to feel, or you're told that you should be feeling like XYZ, and really that's just not how it is. Another reason why I hold this book in my heart is because it really focuses on food. Michelle Zauner wasn't very well versed in Korean cooking and Korean food, and she isn't good at cooking, and so it talks about this guilt, and like food is really used as a way to explore her identity or like reclaim her identity. And there are just so many ways that food plays an important part in this book, whether it be her mum's eating habits throughout her illness, or Michelle Zauner's experience growing up in relationship to food, or just her and her mum bonding over an enormous delicious bowl of food. Like, it's really fun, and as someone who really likes food, I enjoyed it from a kind of arty point of view, but I also really liked discovering new dishes. Yeah, so there was just a lot in this book that I didn't relate to at all, and then a lot that I did relate to, and it was like the perfect combination. because I think sometimes you don't have to relate to everything, but I think sometimes it's really nice to like grapple onto something and be able to project a little bit. But then equally, books are such a brilliant way to learn about other people's experiences. And that's actually one of my notes that I forgot to mention in the introduction to this video. Even if you are someone who's grieving, it doesn't mean you're the expert on grief. I feel that sometimes people who are grievers can be just as hopeless, if not worse, at talking to other people who are grieving, because they're so wrapped up in like their own experience of grief. And so books are another way to make you be a bit more open-minded, help you exercise that empathy and like understand that your experience isn't everyone's experience, because that can happen sometimes. Like people think they're being helpful and they just end up like projecting really hard and it's uncomfortable. Anyway, next up we have Time is a Mother by Vuong, and this is a poetry collection. This is my only Vuong that I've read. He wrote a novel that was really, really popular, but I haven't read that. And this collection of poems, it was written in the aftermath of his mum's death. Lots of mums dying in this collection. Not a coincidence. I haven't read poetry. I used to read loads when I was younger. I haven't read it in ages, so I'm definitely out of practice and I was quite rusty when I read this. But even so, even if I didn't kind of fully understand or could articulate why I liked some of these poems, there was just this overall feeling. It was just this emotive wave, this like tsunami of emotion. He's so, so talented and I completely get the hype. It's kind of dreamlike. You're like really floating along as Ocean reminisces, but it's also incredibly vivid. I don't know, I think it's that combination of things that makes it really magical. And I think what's really fun about poetry is that it's obviously a bit more bite-sized. I actually recommend just like randomly finding yourself on a page. I do think this should be read cover to cover, but obviously you can also revisit, and I'm gonna read this again quite soon because I think, you know, new meanings, new emotions will reveal themselves to me. Next up, I do not have the book because I got it from the library, but The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. This is whiplash actually. Like the others have kind of been memoirs or personal experience, but this is a very short novel. Is it even considered a novel? It's 80 pages and it's very famous. I hate it when people say things are famous because then if you don't know it, you're like, oh, I'm out the loop. Anyway, it's kind of hailed as like the masterpiece on death and dying, and it's the story of a high court judge who is given a terminal diagnosis and dies. And so far he's led a pretty okay life, or at least he's actually led quite a good life, but he sort of has just wandered through it, never really considering death. And the 80 pages just like explores his unraveling. It explores like his feelings around death, his reflections on his life, also the way people respond to him now that he's dying, and the way he feels about the way people respond to him. There were just so many really insightful things about like the discomfort people feel around dying. How, Tolstoy asks, does an unreflective man confront his one and only moment of truth? It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Give it a read. And I would also recommend it if you are in search of a book about grief that's a little bit more distanced. I think some books are just so emotionally intense, whereas this is a little bit more academic. Even though it's still a story and it's sad, it's a little bit more distanced and it's kind of just, yeah, it's like a bit of an intellectual discussion told through a story. Next up, another library book, so it's not present in real form, is Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. This is a novel, but it's told in quite an interesting structure. It kind of ends up reading like a long poem or like lots of poems strung together. You have three perspectives: a husband who has just lost his wife suddenly, the two sons, and I found it really interesting actually because the two sons, they're just merged into a ball, which I think that didn't make sense. They share a perspective, which I think goes to show that the book is kind of like low-key written for the husband, because it's kind of unfair on the sons to just merge their perspective, but they're quite young, so I think that's where it comes from. Anyway, and then the final perspective is that of a crow, who's kind of like the Nanny McPhee of grief. He just arrives on the doorstep. Actually, is the crow gendered? I'm not sure. The crow arrives on the doorstep. He's a bit sort of cheeky and teases them and a bit of a prankster, but he is there to help them grieve. In case you haven't guessed, it's quite a weird, slightly abstract tale about grief, but similar to the death of Ivan Ilyich, it's got a lot of little pearls of wisdom about how it feels to grieve the pain of death, but also overcoming that initial period of grieving. So it's a really insightful book, and it's not very long. And the rhythm of the writing, as I said, it's kind of got a bit of a poetry vibe about it. The rhythm is also like, it's very fast paced and keeps you going. Again, it's moving, but I would recommend it if you want to read something about grief that isn't gonna completely, you know, leave you in floods of tears at 3 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, like on the bus. Anyway, The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. This one I debated putting on the list. Not really. It was always going to go on this list because it's a brilliant piece of writing. It's one of Joan Didion's memoirs, and it's about the year that follows the sudden death of her husband. Her daughter was also really unwell at this point, was like in and out of hospital in comas and things like that. So she's having this extraordinarily painful year, and she's slightly losing her mind in the grief and the stress, but this book documents it all, and it's a pretty brilliant, interesting story. And I know that a lot of people, this is like meant to be the book. I personally found it actually quite detached and not as emotive as Crying in Kmart, as an example. Maybe you want that, maybe you want something a bit detached, but it was interesting how it's almost like she's too much of a journalist writer. And I guess also when you're going through something super painful, it is really hard to write something that feels incredibly raw and incredibly emotional. But yeah, that's something that surprised me. Next up, another memoir, we have Will This House Last Forever by Xanthi Barker. This book also has a pretty special place in my heart. It's written by a daughter who loses her father. The father, though, is very absent throughout her life and is quite a sort of chaotic, difficult to pin down figure, difficult to form a connection with figure. He dies relatively slowly as well, so it's not a sudden death. He dies of cancer. I think what's so incredible about this book is she's writing about a relationship that never really fully formed, and she never really knew him, and she also, a big part of her really hated him. A big part of her almost wasn't missing him from her life after he died. So I think what this book is really good for is talking about the relationship doesn't end just because the person has died. You still, as you grow, are kind of looking at things in hindsight, or just, you know, processing, thinking about things more. You still are developing that relationship. And I guess it's kind of one-sided, but you're still working things out. It's kind of lovely because she does find peace. I'm sure the writing of this book was a part of that process. Finding peace and resolving things even after someone's died. And she herself is also quite a complicated character with quite bad mental health issues at points. And she also tells the story of her dad and her mum meeting, and that's quite beautiful. So she gives this really lovely, contradictory story. This is actually a book I don't see people talking about that much. The voice is also particularly raw and moving. She directs the book towards her dad. She's talking to her dad. There's a lot of you and I. You almost feel like you shouldn't be reading the book. You're really fly on the wall on a very intimate conversation. Beautiful, beautiful. I feel like I'm using the word beautiful a lot, but no regrets, because it's what I mean. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are books that as I went in, I knew I was about to read a book about grief. But then there are also books that grief as a theme sprung out at me when I just really wasn't expecting it. And the following few books are the latter. The first I want to talk about is Rouge by Mona Awad. This book it's similar to Bunny, which is her other book. So it's kind of gothic, surreal, spiraling cult. It starts with the death of our protagonist's mother, and she has a very complicated relationship with her mother. There's kind of this weird competition. Her mother sees her youth as a threat. In the months leading up, barely even speaks to her mother, or doesn't really speak to her mother, but is pretty estranged for the years leading up. Sorry, there's a fly. It was a useful book to be holding for the approach of a fly. And in ways, her mother just wasn't there for her at all as a child. At the funeral, she sees this woman in red who kind of intrigues her. And she also uncovers that her mother was behaving quite weirdly in the last few months before her death. She follows the lady in red and discovers this beauty cult, and that unravels, and that's kind of what it's about. But while that's happening, you have her reflecting on her relationship with her mother. It's also revealed that her father was Egyptian and her mother is white. So you also have this layer of like her mum not really understanding her experience and also being quite insensitive at times to it. It's kind of one of those books where you are talking about one thing, i.e. her beauty cult experience, but actually the book is really about her processing her grief, but it's just told through a really weird, it's just a weird vessel. So yeah, expect something very surreal and slightly confusing, but also kind of cool and powerful. I think it's sometimes like really fun to talk about grief in a kind of abstract way. I think it's nice to have a mixture. Next up, because I accidentally skipped it from the list, we have I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette Mccurdy. Ages ago when I first read it, I did a kind of full-length video on it. This book, in case you don't know, is Jennette Mccurdy's memoir. She is a former child star. She was a big role on iCarly, and it's about her experience growing up with her incredibly controlling mother. Her mother then dies when she's sort of 25, mid-20s, and she is glad for it, in a way, as the title suggests. This book is just as punchy as you would think it is, based on the title. It's a pretty grisly read, like there's a lot of really traumatic stuff in there, and Jennette Mccurdy is a very talented writer. I'm really excited to kind of read what she writes next, because one of the things in here is that she like always wanted to be a writer, but her mum made her be an actor. She also suffers a lot at the hands of the creator, which is a head producer on the show of iCarly. And so that's probably my only caveat with this book. Like, it is actually really upsetting, and each chapter is just blow after blow of awful thing happening to her when she was younger. It is told with humor, but I did not get the humor. She was being humorous when writing it, but I didn't find myself lolling at any point because a lot of it is just really, really tough. But what this book is really brilliant for is reflecting on complex relationships and just like uncomfortable truths. It's very honest. She also writes with the language of how old she was at the time. So when it starts, the book starts kind of earliest memories when she was kind of 6 or 8, and the tone and the thoughts are that of a 6 or 8-year-old. And I just think it makes it a lot more immersive. You're really understanding the point of view of a child, like these things happening to that child, what that child is thinking at the time. Fleabag, written by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, is a TV show, and the scriptures is the script to that TV show. But you also have the original play that it's based on, which I also recommend, but not as much as I recommend the scriptures. I recommend the show as well, by the way, in case it isn't obvious. Fleabag is about a woman, early 30s, whose best friend has just died, and her mum has died relatively, it's unclear as to when the mum died, but sort of maybe 5 years prior. And it's kind of just about her life unraveling and her trying to piece it back together very imperfectly. She's a pretty imperfect character. It's part of why I love the story so much, because she is a bad person in some ways, in many ways. This is an example of a story where I didn't really consider grief a main theme, but because, well, maybe in part because I am grieving, I found grief to actually be really prominent. Although the story is kind of like, ooh, chaos woman being chaotic, look at her love life, the really strong undercurrent is that this chaos is all in huge part due to her grief. And there are some really huge eruptions and beautiful passages that make it quite clear to me that it's a story about grief and relationships and kind of family, and just how different people are, even just within a family, and how different people process things, but it's also really funny. And Phoebe Waller-Bridge talks a lot about how humor is used to disarm you, and once you're feeling chill and disarmed and enjoying all the humor, you then are vulnerable and left open wide to just the most devastating line or devastating event. And Fleabag's really good for that. Funny, 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 devastating. Funny, 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 devastating. And I enjoy that. I don't know if that sounds enjoyable the way I've described it, but I liked it. The final one on our list is Writers and Lovers by Lilly King. Oh, I was looking for it in my pile, but again, I actually read this one virtually. This is very similar to Fleabag. I mean, they are distinct stories, but the basic setup is very similar to Fleabag. The mother of our protagonist, Casey, has just died very suddenly, and Casey is trying to navigate that, but she's also trying to just navigate her life at the moment. She's an aspiring writer, currently working as a waitress. Her love life is not successful, and this is one where grief, it's not really obviously made apparent throughout the story, but it's a really strong undercurrent, and really the story is about her processing and her trying to grab a hold of her life again after experiencing something so traumatic and kind of discombobulating. She's very lost at sea and anxious, and I found the narrative voice very charming, and the story is actually quite feel-good and hopeful. A book that I would liken it to is The Idiots by Elif Bauman, that kind of lost gal genre of books. Okay, I've done it. I've done my list. I honestly had this video idea on the cards for ages, but it's one of those things I really wanted to get it right, and I also kind of had to hype myself up before filming it because it was a bit nerve-wracking. So I hope I did a good job. I hope you liked it. I hope you're having a lovely week. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.